The feasting hall is a ruin of celebration. The fires have burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across walls that, hours before, belonged to another man. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, spilled ale, wood smoke, and blood. The songs of victory have faded into the guttural snores of exhausted warriors. But in the cold spaces between the sleeping bodies, there is no rest. Here, huddled on the stone floor, are the spoils that do not glitter. The queen, her daughters, the wives of the chieftain's guard, they are the silent inventory of the conquered. Their fine linen is torn, their faces streaked with soot and tears. They are no longer women of rank. They have become a new category of thing, a resource to be tallied. This is the moment history rarely records, the cold dawn after the raid. It is not the end of their story. It is the beginning of a new, unwritten saga, one that will not be carved on a runed stone or sung by a skald. It is a story of translocation, of commodification, of a fate decided by the needs of a foreign economy and the laws of a new god, the silver dirham. Their value has been reassessed, their lineage erased. Their journey into the Viking world begins now, in the chilling silence of their own plundered hall. To understand their fate, one must first understand their new legal and social status. In the Norse world, society was brutally stratified. At the bottom, beneath the carls or freemen and the jarls, the aristocracy, were the thralls. This was not merely a term for a servant. It was a legal classification of non-personhood. A thrall was property, an aerir, a unit of currency like cattle or silver. Upon capture, a noblewoman was stripped of her name, her kinship ties, and her legal standing. She became, in the eyes of Norse law as codified in texts like the Gragas, a piece of living chattel. Her captor was not her husband but her owner. He could use her, sell her, or kill her with near impunity. Any children she bore would inherit her status, becoming thralls by birth, further enriching their owner's household. This transformation from high-status woman to breeding stock was not a chaotic byproduct of war. It was a deliberate, systematic process. It was a core pillar of the Viking economy, a mechanism for fueling the expansion and settlement of new lands from Iceland to the riverlands of the Rus. The capture of women was not incidental to a raid's success. In many cases, it was the primary objective, a harvest of human capital more valuable and versatile than gold. The cold, clerical entries in the Irish annals provide the starkest evidence. These monastic records, written with bureaucratic detachment, chronicle the Viking Age not as a heroic epic, but as a grim ledger of loss. For the year 821, the annals of Ulster state, Itar was plundered by the heathens, and they carried off a great number of women into captivity. There are no names, no stories, just a number. A decade later, in 832, the entry for the monastery at Clondalkin reads, "A slaughter of the holy men of Clondalkin and their house plundered and burnt." Appended to such entries is the understood, often unstated fact that the women of the surrounding settlement were taken. These women, stripped of identity by the annalist's pen, were herded onto longships. The journey across the North Sea was the first filter. Disease, exposure, and despair would claim many. Those who survived would land in the burgeoning ports of the Viking world, Dublin, which would become one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe, or Hedeby in modern-day Germany. There they were sorted and sold like livestock. Their skills in weaving, brewing, or medicine, once the pride of their households, now simply increased their market price, measured in ounces of silver. Confiscated, inventoried, silenced. From the docks, their paths diverged, fanning out across the Norse diaspora. Some were bought by settlers in the new colony of Iceland, destined to become the unwilling matriarchs of a new nation. Others were shipped east, to the bustling markets of Birka in Sweden, where they might be sold again to traders heading down the great rivers of the Rus. The journey could end in the slave markets of Constantinople or even Baghdad, where blonde hair and fair skin fetched an exorbitant price. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, visiting the Rus traders on the Volga River in the 10th century, noted their obsession with slave girls, describing how they were displayed for sale and used by their masters in public. This vast, interconnected network was not random. It was a sophisticated trade route. The movement of these captive women can be traced, not through their own words, but through the forensic evidence left in their bones and the genes of their descendants. If you value this kind of deep, evidence-based history that pieces together stories from scattered and forgotten sources, subscribe to the channel. It is the best way to support this work. Sometimes a name survives the erasure. The Icelandic Laxdæla saga, written down in the 13th century but recounting events of the 10th, gives us one such story. Her name was Melkorka. The saga claims she was the daughter of an Irish king named Muirchertach. Captured in a raid around the year 970, she was sold in a Norwegian market to an Icelandic chieftain named Hoskuld Dalakarlsson. He was struck by her beauty and paid 3 marks of silver for her, a fortune. On the long journey back to Iceland, and for years afterward she refused to speak. She was known in his household simply as the Mute Woman. She performed her duties as his concubine, or frilla, and bore him a son, Olaf. Everyone believed she was incapable of speech. This was her last defense, a wall of silence to preserve the final remnant of her former self. The truth was revealed only by chance. Hoskuld, walking near a stream, overheard her speaking to their young son in a language he did not understand, Gaelic. He confronted her and she revealed her royal lineage. While her status in the household marginally improved, she was never freed. She died in Iceland, an exiled princess whose identity was rescued from oblivion by a single, overheard conversation. Bought, hidden, revealed. Melkorka's story is not an isolated tale. It is a narrative archetype supported by cold, hard science. For decades, the Icelandic Book of Settlements, the Landnámabók, was read as the heroic tale of Norsemen seeking freedom, but modern genetics tells the other half of the story. A landmark 2018 study led by the University of Iceland and Decode Genetics analyzed the ancient DNA of the first generations of settlers. The results were stark. While the paternal lineage was overwhelmingly Scandinavian, around 80%, the maternal lineage was a dramatic reversal. Over 60% of the founding female population had mitochondrial DNA of Gaelic origin from Ireland and Scotland. The math is inescapable. For every Norse chieftain who established a farmstead in that new volcanic land, there was at least one woman, and often more, who had been taken by force. They were not willing pioneers. They were the reproductive engine of the colonization, their bodies the literal foundation of the new Icelandic gene pool. Their Gaelic language, culture, and stories were largely suppressed, but they survived in whispers, in lullabies sung to their half-Norse children, and in the DNA that proves their silent, foundational presence. Raided, shipped, replanted. Within the Longhouse, the captured noblewoman entered a complex and often brutal domestic hierarchy. She was not a wife, a husfrida who held legal rights, managed the household keys, and whose children were legitimate heirs. She was a frilla, a concubine, existing in a state of legal limbo. Her primary role was to provide labor and children. While her son might be acknowledged by his father, his inheritance rights were precarious, often challenged by the sons of the legitimate wife. The husfrida herself, the Norse wife of her owner, was often her most direct tormentor. Sagas are filled with accounts of the vicious jealousy and cruelty inflicted by wives upon their husbands' thralls. In the Gisla saga, the wife Aud demands her husband kill his concubine's brother. The concubine is powerless. Her survival, and that of her children, depended entirely on the whims of her owner and the tolerance of his wife. She was trapped in a permanent state of domestic warfare, with no legal recourse and no kin to defend her. She had to navigate the intricate politics of a household where she was seen as both a threat and a tool, a life lived on a knife's edge. Subjugated, exploited, endured. Not every high-status captive was destined for a life of domestic servitude. For some, a far more public and terrifying fate awaited. In the pagan Norse worldview, the gods required appeasement and major events. The death of a chieftain, the launching of a fleet, a plea for victory, could demand the ultimate price. While saga accounts of human sacrifice are often debated by scholars, The archaeological and eyewitness evidence is deeply disturbing. The most unflinching account comes from the Arab diplomat Ahmed ibn Fadlan. In 922, while traveling along the Volga, he witnessed the ship burial of a Rus chieftain. He describes how, upon the chieftain's death, his household was asked who would die with him. A thrall girl volunteered. What followed was a 10-day ritual of feasting and drinking. The girl was passed from tent to tent, forced into ritual intercourse with the chieftain's chief warriors who told her, "Tell your master I did this only for love of him." This was not an act of passion, but a grim, symbolic transfer of their collective power to the dead man in the afterlife. She was a vessel, her body a conduit for a macabre ritual. The final moments of the girl Ibn Fadlan witnessed were a spectacle of ritualized violence. She was given an intoxicating drink, likely containing henbane or hemlock, and led to the ship where her master's body lay. She sang songs of her homeland, a final, fatting echo of her lost life. Then she was brought into the death tent on the ship. 6 men followed her in. She was laid down beside her dead master. 2 men took her feet to her hands. A woman, described as the Angel of Death, placed a corded rope around her neck, handing the ends to 2 other men to pull. As they strangled her, the Angel of Death began to stab her repeatedly between the ribs with a broad-bladed dagger. It was a dual execution, a combination of strangulation and stabbing, perhaps to ensure the death was a worthy offering. Her body was then placed beside the chieftain's, the ship was set ablaze and pushed out into the river, a floating pyre carrying master and victim into the next world. Her sacrifice was the ultimate display of her owner's power, a power that extended beyond life itself. Drugged, violated, sacrificed. Was Ibn Fadlan's account an isolated horror? The archaeological record suggests not. In 1904, the spectacular Oseberg ship burial was excavated in Norway. In the central burial chamber lay 2 women. One was an elderly, high-status woman, likely a queen or priestess. The other was a younger woman. For decades, it was assumed she was a loyal servant who chose to follow her mistress in death. But modern analysis of her remains tells a different story. Her mitochondrial DNA revealed a haplogroup, U7, which is virtually non-existent in Scandinavia but common near the Black Sea, the very region the Rus traders like those Ibn Fadlan met operated in. Bone isotope analysis showed her diet had changed significantly late in life, matching the diet of the local elite. The evidence points to a chilling conclusion. She was a foreigner, likely a captive noblewoman from the East, brought to Norway as a high-status thrall. When her mistress died, her life was forfeit. Her presence in that lavish tomb was not an honor, it was the final act of ownership. Bound, buried, forgotten. If this forensic approach to the Viking Age, piecing together history from sagas, isotopes, and forgotten graves, is what you seek, then support our work by hitting the subscribe button. Because while submission and sacrifice were common fates, they were not the only ones. There are rare, ferocious accounts of defiance. In 870, the great heathen army marched on the monastery at Coldingham on the coast of Northumbria. The abbess, a woman known to history as Ebe the Younger, knew the reputation of the Viking commanders, the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. She knew that for her and her nuns, capture meant systematic rape, a spiritual violation they considered worse than death. Gathering the sisters, Ebe took a razor and in front of them all sliced off her own nose and upper lip, transforming her face into a mask of blood. She then ordered her nuns to do the same. When the Vikings finally broke through the gates, they were met not by terrified women but by a silent, defiant congregation of the disfigured. Enraged and cheated of their prize, the Vikings barred the doors and set the monastery ablaze, burning all the women alive. Theirs was a choice not between life and death, but between how they would die: defaced, burned, unbroken. The stories of the women of Coldingham, of Melkorka, of the anonymous victim on the Oseberg ship are not footnotes to the Viking Age. They are central to it. The entire economic and social structure of Norse expansionism rested on this constant, violent acquisition of foreign women. They were the workforce in new colonies, freeing up men for more raiding. They were the producers of textiles, a key trade good. They were the mothers of the next generation, their bodies used to populate new territories and expand a chieftain's clan. And in death, they were the ultimate status symbol, their ritual sacrifice a display of power that echoed into the afterlife. Without this engine of enslavement, it is debatable whether the Viking expansion could have occurred on the scale that it did. The longships, the settlements, the vast trade networks, all were built and maintained in part on the stolen lives and forced labor of hundreds of thousands of captured women. They are the unseen foundation upon which much of the Viking world was built. The historical record is a landscape of ruins, and most of these women's stories are lost forever. They have no monuments. Their names are not carved in runic verse. They exist only as ghosts in the data, in the cold ledgers of the Irish annals, in the mitochondrial DNA of modern Icelanders, in the silent trauma of a foreign skeleton buried in a queen's grave. We see them only through the eyes of their captors or through the dispassionate analysis of their bones. The true scale of this tragedy is impossible to calculate, but its echo is undeniable. It is the genetic ghost of a Gaelic mother in a Scandinavian bloodline. It is the lingering horror in Ibn Fadlan's meticulous report. It is the defiant silence of a captive princess in an Icelandic hall. The Viking Age was an era of exploration, trade, and astonishing cultural creation. But it was also an age powered by a brutal and efficient system of human trafficking, whose primary victims were the noble women of the lands they conquered. Their story is the dark, unsettling core of the Viking saga, a history written not in ink, but in blood and bone.